In Unit 8, we're going to discuss two variable statistics. And two variable statistics just means that we're comparing just that, two variables. First, we're going to take a look at two-way tables. And the data from a survey of 50 students is shown in this Venn diagram below. In this Venn diagram, the students were asked whether or not they were taking a foreign language and whether or not they played a sport. So looking at the Venn diagram, how many students are taking a foreign language? So this yellow circle right here tells me how many students are taking a foreign language, and that would be 23 plus 14, and 37 students are taking a foreign language. Second question, the second circle, the blue circle, which is this one right here, how many students are playing a sport? And that would be 14 plus 10, and 24 students are playing a sport. And if you remember from elementary school with the Venn diagram, this middle section means that's the students who are taking a foreign language and playing a sport. So that answers question number 3. How many students do both? 14 students do both. Question 4, how many students do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language? So the students that don't play a sport and don't take a foreign language are not in those two circles, the Venn diagram. They're this number down here in the lower right. And 3 students are outside those circles. They do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language. And finally, question number 5, how many students play a sport but do not take a foreign language? So again, here's the section of students who play a sport. This is the section of students in here who take a foreign language. So of those that play a sport and do not take a foreign language, they just play a sport, that would be 10 people. So another way to display that data in the Venn diagram is to make a two-way table. And a two-way table is used to examine the relationships between two categorical variables, and it's similar to a Venn diagram. And remember, a categorical variable means that whatever data we're taking we can put into a category. Unlike a numerical variable, numerical variables we can find the average of. So we're saying, what's the two categories? You play a sport or you take a foreign language. Those are the two categories. And a two-way table has a column variable and it has a row variable. So the column variable are those that play a sport and do not play a sport. So here's our column variables right here. You play a sport, you do not play a sport. And then we have our row variable, which is just like it sounds like. And our row variable is right here. Those are the students that take a foreign language and the students that do not take a foreign language. So we're going to use the data from above in the Venn diagram and in questions 1 through 5 to fill in the two-way table below. So going back to our data, the first section right here is how many students play a sport and take a foreign language. So this section right here includes the students who play a sport and take a foreign language. So let's go back up and look at our Venn diagram. How many students play a sport and take a foreign language? And that would be 14 students. So that's what I'm going to fill in this column right here. Okay, underneath that, how many students play a sport but do not take a foreign language? So going back up to my Venn diagram again, we're looking for the students who play a sport but do not take a foreign language, and that's this 10 right here. So total number of students that play a sport, which is the same as number 2 above, is 24. So we're going to do the same thing with the students who do not play a sport. So again, going back up to my Venn diagram, how many students do not play a sport? That's this section right here. That would be 23. And then underneath that, how many students do not take a foreign language and do not play a sport, and that's these three right here. So our column variable, what we're identifying here, this box right here, are students who do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language, and that's 23 students. And then the second column, the second row, students who do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language, and that's those three that were over in the corner. So to total up the students who do not play a sport, that's a total of 26 students. So now we have to look at our total column right here, and we're going to total up this row right here. So how many students take a foreign language? It's 14 plus 23, and 37 students take a foreign language. How many students do not take a foreign language? Well, that's 10 that play a sport and 3 that do not play a sport, for a total of 13. And then finally, this row right here, the 24 and 26, that's our total students who play a sport, and our total students who do not play a sport. And this column right here, which is students who take a foreign language and students who do not take a foreign language, that column and that row should both add up to 50. And 37 plus 13 is 50, and 24 plus 26 is 50. So again, just to go over this again, our column variable is what's titling our column, which is play a sport and do not play a sport. And our row variable is what's titling our rows, students who take a foreign language and do not take a foreign language. And then finally, this total right here is the total number of students that were surveyed. Before I move on to the next page and then fill in those notes, I want to talk about marginal frequencies, and that's on the next page. And marginal frequencies are the totals of each individual category. These are located in the margins of the table, and again, these are the ones that I have boxed in here and boxed in here. And then we're going to use our table to fill in what the marginal frequencies are. So our marginal frequencies, in this case, are students who play a sport, students who do not play a sport, students who take a foreign language, and students who do not take a foreign language. Those are our marginal frequencies, and I'll fill that in on the next table. Here's our table from the other page. I just copied and pasted it, and I was talking about marginal frequencies. Marginal frequencies are just the totals of each individual category. So for play a sport, the marginal frequency is 24. For do not play a sport, the marginal frequency is 26. Take a foreign language, it's 37. And do not take a foreign language, it's 13. So marginal frequencies, and again, frequency is just how many people are in that category, are the totals of each individual category. So students that play a sport, that would be this marginal frequency right here. So students who play a sport would be 24. How many students do not play a sport? That's this marginal frequency right here. It's 26. Students who do not play a sport but take a foreign language are these students right here, which is 23. And then finally, students who do not take a foreign language are these 13 right here. So those are marginal frequencies. Okay, we also have something called joint frequencies. And they are the values that join the two variables together. And we're going to use the table to fill out the joint frequencies. So joint frequencies are usually joined by an and. That's how you know it's a joint frequency. So if we want to know how many students play a sport and take a foreign language, that's where we go. Play a sport and take a foreign language are 14 students. So 14 students take a sport and they also take a foreign language. If we want to know how many students play a sport but do not take a foreign language, so here's our play our sport column, do not take a foreign language, and this is a joint frequency because we're talking about two things, and that's 10 students. How many students do not play a sport but they do take a foreign language? So do not play a sport, they do take a foreign language, that would be 23. So it's kind of like the old multiplication table, take a foreign language and do not play a sport. So where do they meet? They meet at 23 right there. So 23 students do not play a sport, but they do take a foreign language. And finally, students that neither play a sport nor do they take a foreign language. So how many students they do not play a sport and they do not take a foreign language? And again, do not take a foreign language, do not play a sport, and that's these three right there. Okay, we're going to use the table we just created the table we just created uses frequencies. Some people better understand all this data if it's displayed as a percent. And we can do this by creating a two-way relative frequency table. And relative frequency is found by dividing the frequency and the overall total. So let me move that here. So relative frequency is found right here by dividing the frequency and the overall total. And our overall total is right here. Our overall total of all the students surveyed is 50. So we need to write the percentage of students who play a sport and take a foreign language. And so we know from up here that 14 students play a sport and take a foreign language. That's our joint frequency, and that's 14 out of 50. And as a percent, that's 28%. Our joint frequency for students who play a sport and do not take a foreign language is 10 out of 50 students total, and so that percentage is 20%. And then our percentage for the total students who play a sport, that's a total of 24 out of 50 students, and that's 48%. So we'll do the same thing for students who do not play a sport. Those who do not play a sport and take a foreign language are 23 out of 50, which is 46%. The joint frequency students who do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language is 3 out of 50, and that's 6%. So for the total, 26 students out of 50 do not play a sport, and so 52% of the students do not play a sport. So do not play a sport, that's 52% of the students, and students who play a sport is 48%. And so if we add those two percentages up, if we surveyed all the students, that's 50 out of 50, which is 100%. And then we can do the same thing for the total. 37 out of 50 students take a foreign language, that's 74%. And then 13 out of 50 students do not take a foreign language, and that's, whoops, it's not 100%. That would be 26%. And again, we did it correctly. 74% plus 26% is 100%. So now we're going to answer the following questions based on the previous table. What percent of students play a sport but do not take a foreign language? So the students that play a sport but do not take a foreign language is 20%. What percent of students do not play a sport or take a foreign language? So do not play a sport and do not take a foreign language, that would be 6%. What percent of students take a foreign language but do not play a sport? So do not play a sport and take a foreign language is 46%. And what percent of students play a sport and take a foreign language? So play a sport and take a foreign language is 28%. So here's where you have to be careful, because it says what percent of students. So what percent of students? We're talking about the total number of students, and the total number of students is 50. So if we go with this one, what percent of students play a sport but do not take a foreign language, we're talking about the overall student population, which is different than this one right here. What percent of students who play a sport? So how many students play a sport? 24 students play a sport. It says what percent of those students also take a foreign language. So if we go back to our other table, how many students who play a sport also take a foreign language? That would be 14. And we need to change that to a percent. So let's go back to the first table that we filled in with just the marginal and joint frequencies, and go back to this question right here. What percent of students who play a sport? Well, how many students play a sport? That's 24. So that's where the 24 came from right here. And of those students who also takes a foreign language, well, 14 take a foreign language. So that's where we got the 14 out of 24. What percent of students who don't play a sport? Well, how many students do not play a sport? That's 26. Of those students who do not play a sport, who also do not take a foreign language. So of those 26, 3 do not take a foreign language. And as a percent, that's about 13.8%. So same thing with this one. What percent of students who take a foreign language? Well, how many students take a foreign language? That's 37. And of those 37, how many also play a sport? So of those 37, 14 play a sport. So 14 out of 37 gives us about 37.8%. And finally, what percent of students who don't take a foreign language? So how many students don't take a foreign language? 13. And of those 13, how many of those 13 play a sport? That would be 10. So 10 out of the 13 students who do not take a foreign language, 10 of those play a sport, and that's about 79.8%. Now it's your turn for multiple choice question number 1 and free response number 2. At a wedding reception, the guests have a choice of chicken or steak for dinner. Do more people prefer chicken or steak? Do more people under 40 prefer chicken or steak? So you're answering 2 questions, and the first question is this one right here. Do more people prefer chicken or steak? Or do more people under 40 prefer chicken or steak? Second one, free response. The two-way frequency table shows the favorite part of watching a school football game for people in 2 age groups. Find how many more people surveyed prefer the football game to the halftime show. And you can answer both of those questions in the Google form.